All right, we're going to do skulls now, the hands-on portion of the skulls. And when we start with skulls, the first thing we're always looking at is teeth. So let's just review that real quickly. We've got all animals have teeth just like ours. There's incisors in the front, then the canine teeth, and then the back teeth are molars. So what we're looking at is absence of canine teeth means it's an herbivore. When we've got canine teeth, we've got a predator or an omnivore. So canine teeth, extremely important. Then we move to the molars. The sharper the molars are, like this one, the more predatory the animal. The flatter the molars, the more omnivorous or the more herbaceous the animal. And actually, the more omnivorous they are, omnivory kind of starts in the back of the molars. So if the back molar's flat, front molars are still pointed, it's less omnivorous. If all of them are flat, then it's more omnivorous when it's got canine teeth. So start with canines, move to the molars. That's telling you something about the animal. Let's compare that skull and this skull. Lack of canine. 2 incisors, very strong, big incisors, only molars. The molars are flattened. We have no canines. We know this is an herbivore. Big incisors to cut with, big flat molars to crush vegetation with. So, difference between an herbivore and an omnivore or predator. Then the next thing we want to look at after we look at the teeth is we want to look at the head shape. So top of the head, the bottom of the head, or the jaw is at my hand. So you see a big difference in the head shape there. This one is way more flattened. This one is way more rounded. So what this is telling us is the more rounded, the more terrestrial the species is. Flattened species are typically aquatic species. They flatten out and swim in the water. There are arboreal species. They climb trees and flatten themselves against trees to escape predators. Sometimes they can be subterranean, living underground, and you don't want to have to make a really big hole for a really rounded head. So terrestrial, aquatic, arboreal, or subterranean. So, and you can see the big difference in those two, flattened versus rounded, terrestrial versus the other. So that's the second thing you look at. Then you want to move to size. So, put some skin around the head. Think about what size animal that is. So we've got, a small to medium sized animal versus a much larger animal. So size comes into play next. But again, remember, some animals are small and some animals are big, even in the same species. So that can be a little bit tricky. So let's just start with our biggest skull. Our biggest skull here, again, we look at the head shape. It's rounded. It's not flattened. Flattened would be from nose to the back of the head. This is rounded. Pretty large head. We have canines, and we have pretty sharp molars. We do have a little bit of flattening here in the back. If you can see that, that is showing that there is some omnivory in this animal, but more predatory than omnivorous. So that size, we should probably really only have 2 guesses now, because another thing we should be thinking about is, what does this head look like when I put skin on it? It's got a long nose. I'm thinking you should be thinking coyote, red fox. You're not thinking bobcat because bobcat doesn't have that long nose. If you think about your cats at home, they have a much flatter face than your dogs who have an elongated face. Same with our wild canines and our wild cats. So we should really only be thinking about the canine family here, the dogs. So red fox and coyote are our two biggest ones, and this is a coyote. Fairly large skull. It can get larger than this. It can get smaller than this. So give you a little comparison here. Coyote, red fox, the skulls are basically exactly the same except for size. Again, if we look at the teeth, we see the canines, we see the molars. Molars getting flat in the back. They're actually a little bit flatter than the coyotes in the back, so a little bit more omnivorous tendencies in this species. This is actually the red fox. Show you the gray fox now. Gray fox getting a lot flatter in the teeth in the molars than the red fox, and the gray fox is more omnivorous than the red fox. So that's giving you some information. Size is giving you information, but the real distinguishing characteristics, because if you don't have two that you're being tested on, it's hard to compare size because you might not remember in your head. The one distinguishing characteristics between a red fox and a gray fox are this cranial ridge right here. You see this ridge on the skull. On the gray fox, that ridge makes a U. On the red fox, that ridge makes a V. So you can see the difference between those. Again, gray fox has a U cranial ridge, red fox has a V cranial ridge. Coyote also looks exactly the same, has that V cranial ridge, but the coyote is bigger and less omnivorous. It basically has the back tooth flattened and not as flattened in the second to the back tooth. If you remember, I said that omnivory starts in the back and goes forward. The more omnivorous you are, the more flattened it goes forward. So that's our three canines. Canines, or that's our three dogs, maybe I should have said. Canine teeth. Molars, extremely pointy. So we know that we've got something that's really carnivorous, doesn't have much omnivorous characteristics, extremely rounded, flattened nose, not like the dogs we were looking at. In this size, we should really only be thinking about one thing right now, and that is a bobcat, and that's a bobcat skull. Now, let's compare that to another animal about the same size, but look at the differences in the skull. Extremely flattened, bobcat extremely rounded. So what is this telling us about this animal? This animal is either, this is terrestrial, this is going to be aquatic, arboreal, or subterranean. So when we think about our Mississippi native species about the size of a bobcat, we don't have a species that big that spends a lot of time underground. We don't have a species that big in a tree that spends a lot of time in a tree. So we should be thinking aquatic here. So the aquatic animal that's about the same size as the bobcat is what? It's the river otter. So that's a river otter skull, and you see how we got there. Again, if we'd have started with the teeth, we would have seen it's got canines. We would see that it's flattened in the back. River otters eat a lot of fish and some other aquatic animals, so they are extremely carnivorous. So a lot of the same characteristics except for that head shape. Now, go to a really big skull here. Big animal, flattened Start with our teeth. We see the lack of canines. We see that all we have is the incisors and the molars. So we know this is a herbivore. This is a very big herbivore, but look how flattened it is. So it's not terrestrial, it's aquatic or arboreal or subterranean. Again, we don't have an animal that big underground. We really don't have an animal that big that spends an extreme amount of its time, basically its whole life, in trees. So we should be thinking aquatic. The aquatic herbivore species that's that big, we should only have one guess, and that guess is the beaver. So that is a beaver skull. You see how we got there? We got there with teeth, and then skull size, skull shape, and then skull size. So let's move into our medium-sized animals. Look, we've got canines. We've got a little bit of flattening in the back, but pretty strong points on the molars. So this is an omnivorous species. Even if it was a carnivore, that size, again, not flattened. It's rounding into a neck. So we should probably have maybe 3 guesses in this size mammal that's an omnivore. That would be possum, Virginia opossum, that would be raccoon, and maybe a skunk. So what's the differences here? Another skull about the same size. We look at the teeth on this one. We've got canines. We've got molars. The molars a lot more flattened than this one. So this one is more omnivorous. It eats more plant material, but it is an omnivore. Both of them about the same size. This one is rounding into a neck. So both of them terrestrial. What's really interesting in these two is the brain cavity or the cranium right there. Got a really small brain cavity in this one, much bigger brain cavity in this one. The small brain cavity is a Virginia opossum. That's always the case. And I said with the feet, it was a weird little animal. It's a weird little animal with a small brain and has a weird skull. So we know that that's a possum because we can clearly see the distinguished characteristics of the small brain cavity. We should really have only 2 guesses for this one now. We should be thinking raccoon. We should be thinking possibly skunk. So look at the teeth on this one. Again, canines. Again, extremely pointed molars. So this one is really kind of more carnivorous than this one. Not as much omnivory in it. So more predatory. If we look at them, this one is rounded some, but not as rounded as this one going down into the neck. So we start to think about maybe this one is arboreal or subterranean. This is actually the skunk. It's the smaller one. The raccoon is the bigger one. And the skunk is terrestrial. That's why it's got that rounded shape. It's a little more flattened because it does spend a lot of time in holes, underground, under houses, whatever. It likes to live in a hole. Whereas this one's in a tree in a hole or something like this one. This one's usually on the ground in a hole or something. So a little more flattened, but not as flattened as the aquatic species that we've seen. So striped skunk, raccoon, differences in size and a little bit of shape right there is what's giving you the distinguishing characteristics on those. All right. Looking at 2 roughly the same size right there. If we start looking at the teeth, no canines. We know this is a herbivore. We've got canines. We've got extremely sharp molars. So we know this one is a carnivore and a pretty strong carnivore. Look at both of them, really flattened. So we start thinking aquatic, maybe arboreal. We saw the subterranean on the skunk just now was a little bit more rounded. This is a lot more flattened. More flattened generally means aquatic. So if let's just set this one down and talk about our herbaceous, about this, or our herbivore, about this size, probably aquatic, maybe arboreal. We should really only have two guesses now. We should have muskrat and squirrel. So let's compare the two. Well, we just lost a tooth there. So we got no canines here. We know this is a herbivore. One is a squirrel and one is a muskrat. So the most flattened one is the aquatic one, the one that's a little more rounded in the nose here, maybe even a little more rounded in the neck. That's the squirrel. So the difference there is in the flatness. Not a lot of difference in size. So that's going to be one. If you get one of these on the test and you don't have the other to compare it to, you might just be making a 50-50 guess there and hoping for the best. But at least you're down to 50-50 guess and not just making a wild guess. So we've got it down to two species. All right. So picking this one back up that we said was aquatic, we identified that it was really carnivorous. That size aquatic, we should probably only have one guess now, and that's a mink. So that is a mink skull, really flattened because it's aquatic. Minks are voracious predators, really predatory when we look at the molars. All right, we just showed you the squirrel, comparing it to the muskrat, and we figured out how to tell the difference between the two. Here's our other herbivore now that's basically left. We've got no canines. We know it's an herbivore. And we look at the head shaped. You compare the two, much more terrestrial right here. Much more flattened right here. We said this was the squirrel. It was flattened, but still a little bit rounded because it's arboreal. This one is much more terrestrial, completely terrestrial. So when we're comparing the two, if I gave you just one of these skulls, you should really have three guesses. That would be the muskrat, the squirrel, and a rabbit. So when we try to distinguish between those three, it's the shape of the head really is what gets us there. So shape of the head, we know this one, we've talked about it as a squirrel, so that leaves this really rounded one, this really more terrestrial one, as the rabbit. So we've gone through all of our skulls now, talked about how to distinguish them. Start with teeth, then we go to the shape of the head, the flatness, then we go to the size, and then in the dogs, we go to that cranial ridge for the distinguishing characteristic.